So welcome everybody. My name's Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center, and it's great to have you here this afternoon for a discussion of a really fascinating and emergent topic, Catholic social teaching and animal rights. In a second, I'll introduce a friend, Charlie Camosy, and Christine Gutleben, who will lead us in the discussion. But just first a couple of remarks on the background. Why is this an emergent topic? Well, I think there are lots of reasons. Animal rights, which goes by many names, non-human animal rights maybe, really goes back to the 1970s. It goes back before then, but it emerged in the public consciousness in the 1970s, and has never really been seen to be at the center of religious concerns. That's changing. In addition, Catholic social thought is attaining greater prominence, in great part due to this Pope, to Pope Francis and his emphasis on human rights, human dignity, and the poor, and also the environment. So there are connections there. Here at Georgetown, you may know we have a new initiative on Catholic social thought and public life, which just got started this last year. So there's a lot of interest on campus on Catholic social thought, but how that relates to animal rights is fascinating. It's not something you think of right off the bat. And we have with us today Charlie Camosy, the Christian moral theologian who has thought most intensively about this over the last decade and has a new book out, For the Love of Animals, Christian Ethics, Consistent Action. Just came out in October and has already received a lot of attention. Charlie is an assistant professor of Christian ethics at Fordham. He got his PhD from Notre Dame. We had a chance to meet over the last couple of years as part of a project out of Notre Dame on the intersection of ethics and culture and interfaith dialogue. So Charlie, it's great to have you here with us to lead off the conversation, to kind of frame the topic for us. And then we'll hear from Christine Gutleben, who comes to us from the Humane Society of the United States, where she works as senior director of the outreach program. And since 2007, I believe you've convened faith leaders, people of secular backgrounds, for in-depth discussions of this intersection between animal rights and faith. You're also a pioneer in this area, and we're really happy to have you here to help frame the discussion for us. What we'll do is Charlie will present for 20-25 minutes, and Christine will follow, and we'll have plenty of time for conversation with you all, and we'll end promptly at 1:30. So thanks everyone for coming, and Charlie, thanks for being here. Thanks.
I'd rather sit here and talk, but I'm going to go up there because I have just a few slides. Thanks, Tom, for the invitation. Thanks to Christine, who is taking time out of her very, very busy schedule. She's a new mom in addition to all of her professional stuff. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of the middle of your day to come here. Just a quick little roadmap of what I want to do. I'm going to say a little bit about Catholic social teaching more generally first, and then I'll have something to say about how I see this teaching in conversation with some broader Catholic ideas and scriptural ideas that apply specifically to animals. And then I intend to show just how far apart our current practices are with regard to animals from this understanding, and try to show that this distance means that we must resist our current practices with regard to animals, both at the level of our individual choices and at the level of social structures. Like Tom said, about 20-25 minutes. Christine will then take about 10 minutes to go through some practical ideas for resisting our current practices, and then we both really look forward to your questions. So Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching, many of you know what that is, but Catholic social teaching is often referred to as the Church's best kept secret. With Pope Francis, that secret has become a little less well kept, but the fact that so many people think that Francis is saying something new is evidence that it's probably fair to call it a secret. Catholic social teaching is an authoritative set of doctrines for Catholics, promulgated by popes going back at least to the 19th century. Here are three key principles of Catholic social teaching taken from the website of the U.S. bishops. Let's talk first about the preferential option for the vulnerable. Christianity is not neutral because Jesus was not neutral. Jesus was on the side of the vulnerable and on the side of the marginalized. He was on the side of those whose dignity was inconvenient for those in power. Catholic social teaching has a particular concern for violence, in particular violence done to the vulnerable and marginal populations, and particularly, as you might imagine from the word social, particularly for structural and social violence and injustice. For example, some trace Catholic social teaching back to Pope Leo talking about exploitative child labor as part of free market capitalism as sort of the coming out party for Catholic social teaching. Solidarity. Solidarity is a very key principle of Catholic social teaching. It is a firm resolve as is possible to put oneself in the place of the other, especially the other as most vulnerable. It requires allowing the other to check our own biases and self-interest, putting the needs and flourishing of the other ahead of self-serving desires. And then finally, care for God's creation. This is hopefully a fairly obvious concept, and it actually has a very strong history, especially in recent decades, though many are unaware of it. Benedict XVI became known as the Green Pope. Under his watch, the Vatican actually became the first carbon-neutral state. Francis is picking up where Benedict left off. In fact, he's in the next year or two going to release the first encyclical written totally by him, and it's going to be on ecology. That was just confirmed a few weeks ago. Now, if you're familiar with Catholic social teaching, you might say, well, wait a minute, Camosy, you're forgetting a big principle, the dignity of the human person. And if that's the case, how can you connect Catholic social teaching to concern for animals? Isn't Catholic social teaching about the dignity of the human person? Isn't Catholic social teaching about human beings? The answer to that very important question, in my view, is to think more carefully about how the tradition thinks about justice, or about what another is owed. What another is owed, in my view anyway, reading the tradition, is not just about what human beings are owed, and the Catechism actually has something interesting to say about that. Sorry for the long quote, but I think it's Catholic teaching doesn't have much to say about animals. Here it is. But I just simply want to read it. Humanity's dominion over inanimate and other living beings granted by the Creator is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of his neighbor, including generations to come. It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. Animals are God's creatures. He surrounds them with his providential care. By their mere existence, they bless him and give him glory. Thus, men owe them kindness. We should recall the gentleness with which saints like St. Francis of Assisi or St. Philip Neri treated animals. God entrusted animals to the stewardship of those whom he created in his own image. Hence, it is legitimate to use animals for food and clothing. They may be domesticated to help humanity in his work and leisure. It is contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. This, in my view anyway, is an extraordinary teaching. If anything, it's even a better kept secret than Catholic social teaching. Note that animals are owed kindness. The language of justice is used. And how about the hardcore conclusion at the end? We cannot cause animals to suffer or die without need. Now, many of you might be thinking, how is this possibly biblical? I thought the Bible said all this stuff about dominion and can't we do whatever we want with the animals? But whatever dominion means, and I think that's an important question to ask, and I almost always get asked about dominion. Whatever dominion means, we have to say two things about it. First, whatever dominion humans have over non-human animals, it is given by God and is therefore an extension of God's dominion. And much that's revealed about God's dominion we can find in Genesis 1 and 2. Pretty good place to start. Animals are pronounced good, period, with no mention of human beings at all. God, later on in Genesis 1, insists that humans eat a vegetarian diet. Animals, in Genesis 2, you flip the page, animals are brought to Adam. Why? To eat? No, because it is not good man should be alone. Animals are revealed to be our companions, not our food. Of course, there's no suitable partner found among the animals. That comes later, right? Sin, of course, screws everything up, brings with it violence and death, including God's permission to kill and eat animals, which comes in Genesis 9. The explicit permission is not given to Genesis 9, which implies that it wasn't there before, right? God had to say, I now give you permission, before he didn't have it. And Isaiah is absolutely clear that the kingdom of God is one in which the lamb will lay down with the lion, the baby by the adder's lair. The Apostle Paul in the book of Revelation talk about a new heaven and a new earth. All of creation is redeemed in a peaceable kingdom of nonviolence. And in the meantime, we are called to witness to the kingdom of God, which involves respect for animals. One of my favorite things to mention about the early church is what got read back later as the Council of Jerusalem. The early church had to be thinking about, well, are we a Jewish movement? Are we something other than a Jewish movement? Paul was out there saying, hey, all you have to do is believe in Jesus Christ. And some people back in Jerusalem were saying, wait a minute, what about Jewish law? Jesus followed the Jewish law. They had a council, and they kept about 4 provisions of the Jewish law, the early church did, 3 of which had to do with concern for animals. So no meat with lifeblood, the animal's lifeblood still in it, no meat that had been strangled, and no meat that had been sacrificed to idols. And I think the last one actually has quite a lot to say to us today. Nobody believes in Jupiter anymore, but we do have our idols, consumerism in particular, and I can think of no better example of meat that have been sacrificed to idols than the meat we eat from our factory farms. Speaking of our current practices, what can we say about how they square, what can we say in more detail about how they square with what we just heard? Well, on the one hand, our culture does call out people like Michael Vick, right, for torturing and killing dogs. But this is largely, isn't it, simply because dogs are our pets. We consider them to be cute or even members of our families. Other cultures, of course, do not consider dogs pets. They consider dogs to be food. We may have the temptation to look at these cultures with some scorn or disgust, but we shouldn't be so quick to judge, especially given that our current practices with animals are at least, with animals that are at least as smart and social as dogs, like pigs, are not much better. And Christine will have more to say about this later, but here are some sows in gestation crates. They spend most of their lives pregnant and in situations where they don't even have enough space to turn around. Or how about chickens? As with pigs, these confinement practices are designed with one goal in mind, maximizing profit margins by maximizing what these massive farms call protein units per square foot. These institutions have lost any sense that these animals are good, period. Their only value comes from their ability to be consumed by us and to create profits for corporations. They are now seen as mere products. And it gets worse. The breeding practices are literally creating new kinds of animals. They're so much bigger now than they were in the wild. Indeed, consider that turkeys are now bred with breasts so large that they cannot even have sex with each other. Perhaps you saw the show Dirty Jobs, where they showed a worker who had to manually stimulate the male turkey to get the semen for artificial insemination, and use air compressors to get the semen into the hen. You think that's bad? Biotechnology has now taken this all to a new level. Many factors, many different factors can lead to substantial changes in how big factory farms maximize protein units per square foot including changes in temperature, lighting, feeding times, etc., and many, many other issues. There are so many things in play now that these corporations hire very smart, very well-trained IT people because of the large amounts of computing power and expertise necessary to get the exact combination of factors to maximize protein units per square foot. In fact, I was in research for my book, I read one paper by an IT guy who noted that chickens are now genetically altered so they never feel full. They never have the feeling of satiation. Why? So they eat as fast and as much as possible and grow as quickly as possible. So, it's bad enough they have the miserable lives they did before biotechnology, but now they're not even offered the modest relief of a full stomach. They're constantly hungry. And this is on a huge scale, right? It's hard to imagine how big the scale is. There are 50 billion animals killed in factory, over 50 billion animals killed in factory farms worldwide. If you think about what that means for us personally, Americans eat an average of about 250 pounds of factory farm meat per year. Most of us, therefore, contribute to factory farms in a pretty substantial way. How should we think about this cooperation? Well, my purpose for being here is to try to think about this from the perspective of Catholic social teaching. So let's just return to the three principles I highlighted earlier. Can you think of a more marginalized and vulnerable group than that of non-human animals? Even the name itself, animal, is often used to denigrate an other. You know, what do we want to do when we denigrate someone? We say they're acting like an animal. And in part because they taste so good, and I still, even though I've stopped eating meat for a while, I'm not one of those vegetarians that doesn't look like, I'm not jealous of your meat right now. So we find their dignity inconvenient. And so we other them by putting them outside our sphere of moral concern. I'm in a sort of online debate with a Christian philosopher right now who I think is a classic, guilty of this in a classic way. He will do everything he can to insist that animals are not the subjects of justice, everything he can, including saying that God and human beings are not in relationships of justice because we're not in equal relationships. He says animals and humans are not in equal relationships, therefore it can't be a relationship of justice because a relationship of justice is among equals. I just don't know how you can defend that theologically, that God and human beings are not in relationships of justice. But that's how far I think some will go to make sure that animals stay out of the justice community. They stay out of our sphere of moral concern. They'll even go so far as to say something like that. That just seems very strange for me as a theologian. So animals, I believe, are precisely the kind of population which must be defended by having a preferential option for the vulnerable. And remember, Catholic social teaching is concerned in particular about violence done to the vulnerable, especially structural violence. I don't believe these big agricultural corporations hate animals. They're simply trying to get our business, and we buy on price. And so they are forced in what Catholic social teaching would call a structural violence or structural sin for the race to the bottom to try to maximize protein units per square foot so we buy their meat rather than buy it from their competitor. So the very structure of seeing animals as products in the context of free market capitalism from the perspective of Catholic social teaching is sinful and structurally sinful. And this is something that Catholic social teaching has called out in other contexts. I mentioned child labor earlier. I think it must call it out here as well. Solidarity. We absolutely need to put ourselves in solidarity with animal populations, putting their needs before our wants, especially given that our dominion is as stewards of creation. God has given us the great gift of being able to be stewards of creation. I don't think anybody can argue that we don't have dominion. The question is what we do with that dominion. And in doing so, we must check our own interests and biases and be convicted by the needs of this vulnerable population. And care for creation, hopefully that speaks for itself. And let's just recall the Catechism's final hardcore prohibition. It is contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. That's Catholic teaching. Do we need to eat factory farm meat? I don't think so. Can we get our protein from other nutrients and other nutrients and other sources? I think absolutely that's the case. Often we need to be educated about this. I had to educate myself about this, but we can. Furthermore, we now know that eating factory farm meat at this level that we do is actually quite unhealthy. So I often get the pushback, well, don't you need a certain kind of amount of meat to be healthy? Well, especially eating this kind of factory farm meat is actually quite unhealthy. I don't need to talk to you about heart disease and the relation of animal fat to that. What's one of the first things that's done if somebody is diagnosed with cancer? You stop eating red meat. Frontline of PBS's Frontline is in the middle of a 2-part expose on the creation of superbugs and drug-resistant bacteria, which come from the overuse of antibiotics. The overwhelming majority of antibiotics we use are given to animals in factory farms. There's some question about how much that contributes to antibiotic resistance in humans, but that it contributes something is not really deniable. Also consider climate change. Again, there's some question about the actual data and at what percentage, but the methane emissions from the huge mounds of feces from the 50 billion animals that are factory farmed every year are comparable in terms of the emissions from cars and planes all over the world. There's this debate about how comparable, but they're at least comparable. So yes, by all means, give up your car for public transportation, but don't support factory farms either for the same reason. So in concluding my presentation then, I just want to say that for those of us who are convinced by these arguments and or take this teaching, the teaching's authority seriously, I propose that this means resisting factory farms, both at the level of individual choice and at the social level of public policy. And Christine's going to give us some more thoughts about that.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure. I've been doing this work for about 10 years, and I've been waiting for someone like Charlie to come along. He has a really unique voice. Waiting for someone to come along to speak so eloquently about Catholic responsibility to animals, and so I'm so pleased to be following you today. See if I can. So I work at the Humane Society of the United States, and HSUS is the nation's largest animal protection organization. And I'd like to point out that our 2 prior CEOs were both clergy, and their leadership spanned 35 years. So that's actually more than half of the organization's existence. And I think that fact really highlights the long-standing Christian history of involvement in the animal protection movement. I could go into the history more quite easily during conversation if you're interested, but there's a lot there. And the Faith Outreach Program was established in 2007. So formally, the organization has been focused on reaching religious communities for the last 7 years, but informally, really since its existence in the 1950s. So I'd like to pick up, though, where Charlie left off. He showed you some images, and I just want to make sure that we're all really on the same page in terms of the magnitude of what we're talking about. So factory farmed animals, they comprise about 95% of the, or more than 95% of the animals that we eat in this country. This is Smithfield Foods. This image was taken on an official tour. This is how pregnant pigs lived. They have about a foot to move forward, a foot to move side to side. They're taken out briefly into a different crate just to nurse piglets shortly, and they're put back into the gestation crates. And the vast majority of pregnant pigs, this is how they live. Just to give you an idea, this video was taken on that tour. So you know, they don't get out of this crate for, I think it's about 6 months, and they're taken out briefly, like I said, and put back in. So you can see how close those quarters are. HSUS works on a variety of issues related to factory farming, but we focus specifically on the three practices we think are most egregious. So gestation crates are one, battery cages, you saw, Charlie showed you an image of that, those are for egg-laying hens. The industry says that each hen is allowed about that much space for their whole life. And then veal crates, which you probably are all familiar with, and thankfully that practice is well on its way out. So this is really where you come in. There are no federal laws to protect farm animals with the exception of the Humane Slaughter Act, which protects livestock at the moment of their death. So HSUS started about 7-8 years ago working on the state level to pass modest reforms to protect farm animals. So you can see these states right here have some laws to protect some of those animals I mentioned, either egg-laying hens, pregnant pigs, or veal calves. And so we're working at the state level to address the issue. Most of the reforms have a long lead time, so I don't think that any of them are currently in effect right now. These are some of the companies that we work with that have agreed to phase out the use of intensive confinement methods in their supply chains. So these companies have agreed to phase out the use of gestation crates in their supply chains. We work with farmers and ranchers across the country to promote their more humane methods and to promote their products. So this is Kevin Fulton. He's a farmer we work with. My boss is actually a pig farmer. And we have agriculture networks across the country to really highlight, that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be the industrial model that we've gotten so used to. And then all of us can participate in the 3 Rs. All of us, everybody. Everybody can do one of these or more. So we all can reduce, and I'll get into that in a minute. Refinement is cage-free eggs, free range, and so on, and replace for those of us who want to take that next step and go vegetarian. Just quickly, so Charlie mentioned the number. So 9 billion animals are slaughtered here in the U.S. for food. That's 1 million animals an hour around the clock, never stopping. It's actually more than that. But just to give you a picture. And interesting, so you can see the issue that's happened as farms have gotten larger, so more animals on those farms. There are the number of farms and the number of farmers have gone down almost in relation to each other. And this is a real problem because when you have fewer farmers, you have fewer caretakers. This is just the same issue seen in another way. This is just since 1980. So just since 1980, you can see this is the loss of cattle farms, pig farms, dairy farms. So the number of animals has gone up drastically and the number of farms has plummeted. Same thing with the workforce, the agricultural workforce. So it's a simple equation. You saw in order to care for that number of animals, you have to confine them because there are not people caring for them. And we're not just producing a lot of meat because we are growing as a population. We are consuming more per person. So you can see just since 1960, we're about 40 more pounds of meat per person per year. This is the number of animals. You can see, this is just relatively short history. So from about 1960, we were still under 1 billion. So from 1960 until now, we've skyrocketed to 9 billion animals. But this is fascinating to me. So in 1990, we were at 7 billion. That's such recent history. I was in high school. So this is actually what we're aiming for. I'm here today to ask you all to participate in this effort to get us back to 1990 levels. And we are on the way there. So you can see that there has been a recent drop in consumption, 500 million animals. And I think this is due in large part to really popular trends. Flexitarian, I'm sure you've read or know people that practice that. Just incorporating more plant-based foods in their diet. Meatless Monday, lots of schools are involved in that, and hospitals. And we see this everywhere. Major corporations are endorsing eating more plant-based foods. This is Kaiser Permanente. The future of medicine will not be a pill, but in fruits and vegetables. So since I'm here at Georgetown University, I just wanted you all to know that there are schools across the country that also serve refined products from farmers that are trying to do the right thing. So nearby, the Philadelphia Archdiocesan school system completely went cage-free back in 2009, and Catholic University in Washington, D.C. is also cage-free. So that's participating in the refinement approach. So I welcome all of you to stay in touch with us. Our website is humanesociety.org/faith, and I'd be happy to connect you with any one of these issues, factory farming issues particularly, and of course HSUS works on a number of issues so that affect wildlife and pets, and so please stay in touch.
Thank you, Charlie and Christine, for introducing, I think, many of us to the magnitude of the issue and linking it up with the Catholic tradition in interesting ways. Maybe I'll take the prerogative of being the chair to ask the first question of Charlie. It's a broad question, but then I'll make it more specific. The broad question is, what's the best counter-argument to your approach to these issues? And how do you deal with it? The counter-argument that I can think of, and I'm very sympathetic to your point of view, so I'm curious to know how you would counter it. And you mentioned it comes back to this issue of humans and non-human animals, and whether from a theological point of view there's not a qualitative distinction between the two, in that human animals have eternal souls and an eternal destiny, and animals do not. You didn't address that, but I'd love to get your take on that, and maybe that's not the toughest question. Maybe there are others, but could you respond to that?
Well, those who are concerned for animals are a diverse group, and some would want to say there's no distinction to be made between human and non-human animals. I don't think that. So my concern for animals doesn't take away from my more serious concern for human persons. I do think human persons matter more than animals, but I don't think it's a zero-sum game. So I don't think, in fact, I think we become better human animals when we develop the kinds of virtues that are like nonviolence and protection of the vulnerable more broadly, more consistently. And so I don't want to say, you know, a rat is a pig, is a person, is a horse, or something like that. I don't want to say that. And I think there is an interesting question to ask about, you know, souls and eternal life. I mean, it's an interesting question to ask about humans, but there are interesting questions to ask that about animals, because after all, I mean, it is classic Christian traditional teaching that all of creation is redeemed, and there's a new heaven and a new earth. And if you go to religious bookstores, the section on sort of doggy heaven is substantial. People have an interest in this. That's an important argument. It's the one I struggle with more, though, personally, as a counter argument. I appreciate you going right there for that. Is the argument you get that this is sort of like a privileged person's kind of point of view. So people of means, people of privilege, get to talk about these things, get to go to shop for more expensive meat, or get to have the kind of lifestyle that permits this kind of thing, and that is something that I do struggle with. I lived before I got married 2 years ago. I lived in the Bronx, very close to Fordham, and those neighborhoods have difficulty participating in this, I mean, we places like Georgetown and Fordham can afford to say, well, we're going to have free-range meat at all of our events, right? My neighbors in that neighborhood would not be able to afford that, right? Now you can get all the protein you need from buying lentils and other things that maybe don't taste as good, or I don't know. I may have had some people that disagree with me about that. But I guess that's where I struggle the most is this sort of a privileged person's point of view?
Thanks. Maybe one question for Christine before I open it up. Could you say something about your outreach to conservative evangelicals? Because you'd think that they'd be the strongest adherents of this dominion theology as it's traditionally been received, and would be most likely to make that sharp qualitative distinction that we've been talking about between non-human and human animals. Can you tell us about your strategy and what's been accomplished with that group?
Well, when I started this work, I assumed that they would be the toughest group. But in fact, pretty early on, that was not the case. We actually do most of our work with evangelicals. The Southern Baptist Convention, for example, the former president of the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission for the Southern Baptist Convention, Richard Land, he did a commercial for us on cockfighting, animal fighting, and the devastation that it causes children and families. And we host meetings. We used to host them every year. We don't anymore. Where we'd come together with nationally recognized faith leaders, and the majority of the attendees would be evangelicals. And I think for them, it comes down to the fact that the Bible is pretty clear about this. I mean, Charlie and I were talking about this. Of course, you can find confusing verses, but for the most part, they see this as pretty clear. So we've really, it's been a surprise, but a wonderful surprise, I have to say. And I'd be very eager to share with you all, if you do stay in touch, some of the work we've done with them. I mentioned the video. But we've worked on, for example, we've got an essay on C.S. Lewis. Professor at Wheaton, Dr. Jerry Root, he's a C.S. Lewis scholar. We've done some projects on William Wilberforce. So Wilberforce was the British abolitionist evangelical. He started the Clapham Evangelicals in England, and he saw that he actually was present and key during the formation of the SPCA. And he saw slavery and the abuse of animals and the abuse of children all correlated. He saw it as a function of the coarsening of society to just neglect and ignore animals. So we've got a lot of work there with conservative Christians.
Great. Well, let me throw it open. I'd ask you, if you have a question, to briefly state a little bit about your background and the question, and we have plenty of time for discussion. So who would like to get us started? Yes. Please wait for the mic.
Okay, so my background is I'm a Georgetown alum. I work in the animal protection field, and I got there because of my faith. I like to say I'm Catholic. I really appreciate this being held today at Georgetown, and I'm grateful for both of your presentations. My question is for Professor Camosy, and it kind of feeds into the first question from the moderator about souls. I always like to say, I believe that we will see animals in heaven, but even if you didn't believe that, you thought that animals would only receive this life that gives us especially a moral imperative to take care of them in this life. But my question was about equality and how you explain it. So you believe that there are differences between human beings and animals, and they're not necessarily on the same field, but how do you reconcile that with animals and humans being equal before God? Because those are the same words, but they might not necessarily have the same meaning. So I was wondering if you could go into that a bit further.
Yeah, equality is a really slippery concept. I mean, whenever somebody starts talking about equality, I want to say with regard to what, right? With regard to what? And the primal, fundamental distinction in all theology is that between creator and created. So in that sense, we are created. We're not creator. We're with the created. But then I do think there is a hierarchy within that creation. So I don't think single-celled organisms matter as much as chimpanzees, or dandelions matter as much as chickens. When it comes to equality, again, with regard to what, if a being can suffer, then getting kicked as a person and getting kicked as a dog, I don't think we need to make distinctions between those. But certain animals are self-aware and certain animals don't appear to be self-aware. And if you're self-aware, you can be harmed in a way that if you're not self-aware. You value your life, you want to keep living, you understand that it's you. And so I do want to say there's a hierarchy and that certain animals can be harmed in certain ways, but that others can't. But to the extent they can be harmed, and we do share equal traits like the capacity to suffer from being kicked, then I think we should treat those equally. But human persons, it seems to me, have traits that most, if not all, other animals do not have, and so can be harmed in different ways.
Hi, thank you guys for your presentations. I have a sort of practical question about the word needlessly. So animals shouldn't die or suffer needlessly, but why does that translate into practical terms? So how do you define need? Because somebody who gets a lot of pure hedonistic pleasure out of eating bacon, like that for them could be a need to eat bacon and be happy, right? Or somebody else who might be anemic and gets a lot out of eating red meat, and so then that's a health need, but then they could also probably take iron pills. So I was just wondering where that line is.
It's a good question for both of you. Charlie, do you want to start?
Well, see, I guess I just don't. My first reaction is to say, the person who wakes up for an afternoon nap and says, "Man, I really need a hot dog," that's not what I think the Catechism has in mind, right? I think somebody who might suffer from a particular type of nutritional deficiency and finds it difficult to get it any other way, that could rise to level of need. But yeah, so I don't know, is that helpful? And then there's a gray area, like what level of nutritional deficiency is necessary before we call it a need. I agree that that's probably an important gray area, and we should let individuals make up their minds about that. But I have very little sympathy for someone who just says, "Man, I get a lot of pleasure, so I need it," or something, right? That's no.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's, Charlie said this a couple of times, but it is a radical statement. To look at the systems, the industrial systems that we have today, and apply that statement really puts us in a difficult spot, because if we waste about 22% of the animal products, the animals that we raise. So, first of all, we're talking about billions of animals we just waste. Clearly, we need to address that issue. The needless argument also could be applied. For example, we work on some hunting issues. So if you're hunting to produce food for your family, that is a respectable thing to do. If you go and hunt for fun because you want to, for target practice, or because you want a trophy, or you want a fur pelt, those kinds of things, I think there are very clear lines there. Killing animals for fun, for example, is an issue that we work on at HSUS. We call them, it's target practice. So I think we can think about, certainly if we look at the companion animal industry, so puppy mills, for example, they exist because people want specific dogs. You have to ask yourself, do I want this purebred Maltese, we don't need those animals, right? There are thousands of animals in shelters waiting to be adopted. And here's an interesting fact. So if 10% of people that want pets, that already want pets, that are buying pets, that go and buy pets from pet stores, if just 10% of those people adopted from shelters, we would have no more animals in shelters. So, some of these issues are very solvable.
Could I ask a follow-up on that? Because it's a good question, this term needlessly. What I didn't hear you say, or either of you say, is that it's wrong to kill animals for food, period. Would you be prepared to say it's always wrong to kill animals for food when the nutrition is available elsewhere?
I admit that I don't. This is a question I struggle with, so I'm in process trying to think about this. I think there's an analogy, and you might appreciate this, to be drawn between just war theory and pacifism in this kind of argument. So, how much do we want to witness as Christians, or as just nonviolent people in general, to a world that is nonviolent? What from a traditional Christian theology perspective, there's a debate between pacifists and just war theorists. The just war theorists want to say, well, we live in a fallen world, there's sin, we sort of have to deal with that. The pacifists respond, that doesn't sound quite like what Jesus said. But so there's this debate, right? I wonder if there is an analogous debate to be had about this. How much do we want to witness to the nonviolent, peaceable kingdom of God that Genesis 1 and 2 and that Isaiah and Paul envisions? And how much do we just say, well, we live in a fallen world, God has given us permission to eat animals in this fallen world. What does that kind of eating look like in a just way? I must admit I'm more in the second one. I'm not a pacifist. But I think we need much more radical. Just war theory is a ethic of limitation, right? It's a limitation to try to limit violence. And I wonder if we don't need some sort of like just eating theory or something like that to limit that other kind of violence as well.
But does the analogy hold? There's no threat from the animals to us, as there is in the case of just war. So what would be the moral case for killing and eating animals if you can get the nutrition elsewhere?
Yeah, I agree that, that's why it's not an analogy, it's an analogy, right? It's only analogous in a certain way. The peaceable, nonviolent thing. I agree. I think you would need a much stronger reason for doing that. And that's why I think for most privileged people, we can afford to do this. I still have a hesitation about those without means. And maybe that's where I get most of my hesitation from. Do we want to say that vegetarianism is an ethic for everyone, including people who live in food deserts and find it very difficult to put any kind of food on the table, much less from Whole Foods or something like that?
Well, the system that we live in is completely lopsided, and we've talked about this. But the factory farming, it really exists based on a false economy. So we're not dealing with reality here. So when we say that certain products are more expensive than others, well, that's because certain products receive an enormous amount of subsidies and certain products don't. And the products that come from farms that don't cage their animals, for example, they don't receive subsidies. Fruits and vegetables receive less than half of 1% of subsidies. So those products are more expensive.
But the Humane Society doesn't take a radical stand on whether it's morally okay to kill animals for food.
Yeah, no. We work with farmers, and as I stated, my boss is a pig farmer, and we support farmers that are doing the right thing, that care about their animals, that practice proper husbandry of their animals. And it is an issue. We've thought about that a lot, about whether or not, if you do have access to plant-based foods, then it is. I think. It becomes a very personal choice for people.
Thank you. Carl?
Sure. So I have a
mic.
My name's Colin, and I work here at Georgetown with Tom. And I have a couple quick questions. The first is, how do you reach out to farmers? Because it's so hard to take the first step when the competition is Tyson or Hormel or whatever, because as you say, excuse me, it is a false economy, but you're never going to be able to compete with the industrialists at that sort of a scale, even if you're doing the right thing, unless you can really sell people on things like it's economical and there is a market for what is currently kind of like niche products about, that are sustainably and humanely raised. So how do you really reach out to farmers and tell them, and ranchers, and encourage this sort of behavior? And I'd sort of append to that, farmers and consumers as well in the developing world, where the standard American diet is a mark of distinction, even though we know it's a false economy and it's generally bad for you.
Well, to answer your question about farmers, most of them, many of them, really dislike the industrial system. So we have farmers on our staff that reach out. They travel the nation, approaching farmers, reaching out, and the reaction is often, they are pulled into a system that they don't want to be part of. The issue is making it more culturally acceptable, I think, within rural America to align with an animal advocacy organization, for example. So, we need to do a better job of saying, we support these farmers, and we're doing that certainly. But like I said, I think they want an economical option, certainly. And I think it's interesting to consider that in some cases, certainly for example with eggs, the increase in production cost is not that great. So the United Egg Producers, for example, they represent about 90% of the egg production in this country. They say that it's less than a penny per egg to change from a cage system to a non-cage system. So that's 12 cents. Now we of course pay more in the store because they know that we're willing to pay a premium for cage-free eggs. But I think in some cases, the economics, certainly if we were to provide a little assistance to these farmers who are doing the right thing, we could level the playing field pretty quickly.
I'd just like to follow up on that by saying this is a classic problem for Catholic social teaching, right? To say this is a structural problem, right? You can do something by trying to convince individual farmers, but at a very basic level, we just need structural change when it comes to this. And having Iowa be the first primary doesn't help. We're dealing with that right now with New Jersey. Our illustrious governor, I live in New Jersey even though I work in New York, has vetoed the ban on gestation crates, not least because he wants to win Iowa, right? And so it's these kind of structural things that I think especially Catholics and especially bishops and especially others who are concerned about structural sin need to step up and say, we need structural change. We need individual change, but we also need change on the structural level.
Hi, that's loud. Claudia Winkler, and I'm here at the Berkley Center. And you already answered now one of my questions, which was, how much more does it actually cost to do some of these more humane practices? But since we've kind of talked about subsidies and then also making this affordable, I see subsidies as a large problem, but would you potentially see that as a solution to this particular issue? I think it's done a lot more, farm subsidies have done a lot more harm than good, but I'd like to hear if you think that that is a good policy for kind of making this more affordable and making this more possible, these other means.
I can't answer that. You're right. I mean, they certainly have created an impossible situation for a lot of farmers. So, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the debate about the farm bill and should we call it a food bill, and because it directly impacts all of us. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of a get big or get out situation.
Hi, so you've given us the Catholic perception of this. To what extent have you thought about making this an interfaith effort involving Muslims, Jews who also have similar views of humane practices towards animals, similar teachings in the holy text that animals come from God and should be treated in certain ways, and halal and kosher practices. I know, for example, there was a recent young adult faith leader summit here in DC, and one of the panels focused on food justice. I don't know to what extent they went into animal rights, but I think that could be quite interesting. So just curious to hear if you've incorporated any other traditions into your research or your advocacy work.
Christine can talk more about this than I can, but I will just quickly say that that I think your question is right on, and I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap in ecumenical work that can and should be done, and is being done in some ways. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of groups out there organizing like Christine's group is organizing, and so we need more infrastructure when it comes to that. But I would just quickly say that the Hebrew Bible is a lot better than the New Testament when it comes to this. I mean, it's not that the New Testament is bad. I think it gets a bad reputation in some ways, but it's much easier actually to work with the Hebrew Bible on this. And I'm not a student of Islam, so I don't feel like I can say much about that.
No, we certainly work with many faiths on these issues. Just to give you a current example, we've got a campaign right now in Michigan to protect the wolves. They have delisted the wolves from protected status, and once they reach that magic number of 650, and so the Muslim groups in Michigan have been very vocal and clear about killing animals needlessly. Certainly in the case of wolves, they don't hunt wolves for food, so it's about trophies and for pelts. And so, for example, the Islamic Society of North America has endorsed the campaign, the Michigan Muslim Community Council, several nationally known Islamic scholars, Dr. Nasser at GW. So we certainly, I bring that as an example just because it's currently what we're doing, but certainly I could go on a case-by-case basis and share with you at the state level and at the national level the work that we've done with a variety of faiths. Yeah, and certainly, I mean, we've talked about, Jewish food traditions, but, speaking to synagogues, for example, about these issues is, this is something that they've been grappling with forever. So I'm very aware of the food issue, certainly. So.
Matt?
Yeah, my name is Nat Adams. I work at the World-Based Development Dialogue here at the Berkley Center. Yeah, I was actually going to ask a similar question to Melody about some interfaith work. Obviously, with our work, we deal with a lot of Hindu and Buddhist communities that also have elements that have a very strong animal rights ethic and are active on those issues. But I'm just wondering, from a practical standpoint, how do you kind of encourage these kind of conversations within faith communities, and then how do you translate then that to action within those communities and making behavior changes? So.
I can speak to one of those communities. I think you need a tie-in to things that are already strong within the community in many ways. So I know I work with a lot of different groups that would self-identify as being pro-life. And I think it's very easy, actually, to say, well, here are some principles that you stand for, and here's how they impact on this other kind of issue. And I've had really good traction on that. And it's interesting that places like National Review and First Things have done stories on exactly this. Like, even Mark Oppenheimer did a piece in the beliefs column in the New York Times showing how more traditional pro-life, conservative type Christians are getting more into these types of issues. And if you can show that this has this other kind of implication, I think that does translate into action, and because they're already doing action on these other fronts. And one of the things that I think in particular that's interesting to talk with regard to the Catholic communities about is Lent is coming up. We used to not eat meat during the whole time of Lent, right? And every Friday outside of Lent. In fact, I think when Dolan was head of the USCCB, he encouraged people to go meatless on Fridays. If we go meatless on Mondays, we go meatless on Fridays, it's not a bad start. So if you can work with the kind of stuff that's already in place, I think that's one way to go.
We have an online library where you can search by tradition and find, so Charlie referenced what's already been said. We've got a library where you can easily find what each tradition has said sort of in an official capacity about animals. So.
I'm Jack. I'm a liaison officer at the State Department. I went to the law school here. And, sorry, I missed what I'm going to ask you covered before. I'm sorry, work gets in the way of your higher priorities. But I had a question and a couple of things to comment. I guess I just wanted to hear your reaction to it. One of them is, like Hindus really, really have deep feelings about animals. And Gandhi said that society is judged by how it treats its animals. And as well as he was equating it to its helpless. And he was tying them all together. And I don't know about animals having souls. I know when Will Rogers said, "If I get to heaven and there's no dogs there, I want to go where they went." But, actually, I thought you were going to. It's interesting on the factory farm business. I was wondering if you were to talk more about the animals that people have such personal relationships with, like particularly dogs, but also cats and horses. People definitely. It does make you wonder about the nature of the soul. But the 9 billion animals, that really shocked me, slaughtered a year. Where do we stack up? And India is a special case because of Hinduism. But where do we stack up in meat consumption, animal slaughter with Latin America and Europe? Because our heavy meat diet comes from Europe. And the Japanese, the Chinese, and Asians always had this, but 10% of their protein came from meat, and 90% of it came from vegetable combinations. And Europe, I think 70% of the protein came from meat, and this has been true for a long, long, long time. And they're really hunter-gatherers, by the way, hunter-gatherers. There's some evidence they were pretty healthy. They only lived about 40, 45 years old at the most, but they were fairly healthy, actually, for surprisingly healthy. I was just wondering where we stack up in our animal consumption versus the other European-based societies, and where Asia, China, and Japan, where they're headed.
Yeah. I could pull up a graph for you so I could get very specific with the numbers, but we're the leader in consumption. I believe China and Brazil are close, very close behind. They're catching up at a very rapid rate. And the issue, of course, is that can the planet sustain another United States in terms of consumption of animal products? That's a concern. Yeah, I'm going to pull up specific numbers for you to answer that question. Yeah.
Charlie, did you have any comment on the
Just briefly, Hinduism is obviously one example, but many faith traditions, especially to the extent they espouse a kind of nonviolent virtue ethic, will say things like, a person reveals their virtue or vice on how they treat the most vulnerable, and particular animals are part of that, no question about it.
Hi, I want to ask, first of all, how many students are here? And then I'd like to ask you, Professor Camosy, in terms of the involvement of students at Fordham University on issues having to do with animals, animal rights, this sort of thing, what kind of student community exists there? And then do either of you have recommendations for how to get more students involved in these issues? And I might say that there's a new student organization at Georgetown, Animalia, and it's having its organizational meeting tomorrow night. But actually getting people involved, students involved in these issues is difficult, primarily because they do see it as a vegan only. If you're not a vegan, then you're not a member of you're not part of the body. And they love their dogs, but it's difficult.
I'd say two things about that. On the level of ideas, I actually find millennials to be much more friendly to these ideas than older people. There are exceptions, of course, but if I just randomly start talking about these issues with someone who's in their 60s, I sort of brace for impact. And if I talk to a 19-year-old, I get excited because I know almost certainly they're going to at least, they might not turn vegetarian on the spot, but they're going to take it very seriously. That doesn't translate to activism, at least at Fordham it doesn't. In part because, and again, these are broad generalizations, but I have experience with this. I just think my students have a lot of apathy and have a lot of cynicism. And that might be different here at Georgetown, I don't know. But I think they've seen a lot of failure and a lot of frustration. They've had a lot of frustration. And so it's difficult to get some, another thing, in terms of advice, just say, talk about this in your classes, right? Every class every course, I find a way to talk about animals somehow. My students, we have a great time that class or that week or that 2 weeks, but there's nobody out there ready to create Animalia or something like that. So I do what I can in the classroom. I suppose maybe I could be more proactive about trying to build with some of the energy we have in the classroom. But that's my experience, is that on the level of ideas, it's fertile ground, but at the level of community activism, I've had some frustration. So.
Did you find some stats?
I did. Unfortunately, this is a UK graph, so you'll have to convert to pounds from kilos, but can you all see that? You can't see it?
Why don't you just read off some of the...
You can, okay. So if you visually, the US is the clear leader at 124 kilos. And then Europe is at 89, Brazil 79, China 54, and Japan 42. So, and you can see just in the last 40 years, the consumption per person increase is drastic.
It skyrocketed in China and
Sky.
Japan. Post-war, that was a huge shift in their
Yeah, but even China is still less than half of where we are currently.
So I'd like to take it back to issues of moral theology and ethics. It doesn't mean we can't return to the more political conversation, the activism conversation. But Charlie, you've been in conversation over the years not only with fellow Catholics and Christians, scholars, but also with secular bioethicists. I'm thinking in particular Peter Singer at Princeton, the most well-known and of course a pioneer in the whole field of animal rights for decades now. Can you share with us a little bit your dialogue with Peter Singer, where you find common ground with such a secular voice, and interestingly, where there's still differences, given that you're coming out of a very different tradition?
Yeah. So I came to these issues after reading Peter Singer's work, not unlike many thousands and thousands of people. I didn't find it at first in my own tradition, but I eventually did. So I read Peter Singer's work and became convicted, and then as a moral theologian went back to my tradition and found things that were surprising, with lots of interesting ideas and traditions to mine. And we're just getting started. This is a really hot issue, to the extent anything is hot in theology. This is really hot. We're having our first ever academic journal devoted entirely to Catholic thought about animals coming out this summer, the Journal of Moral Theology. So the two things to say about the relationship with Peter, as some of you know, his big book that came out first in 1975, Animal Liberation, basically called out Christianity for being the problem, right? The sanctity of life ethic as being the problem, the idea of dominion being the problem. But at a recent event at the Humane Society, he and I did a co-presentation where he revealed that he now considers Christianity to be an ally, not just not the problem, but an ally for animal liberation. That's taken place in part because of some of the conversations he and I have had. But I think he realizes more and more that what's really driving our practices is not some sort of, I mean, few people, even self-professed Christians, take their theology seriously as motivating factors in their lives. What they take much more seriously, I think, are their economic interests, and that's actually what's driving these practices and our understandings, it seems to me. And I think he realizes that too. And so we need more traditions of thought to come and challenge the consumerist social structures which are driving our practices and our understanding of animals as mere products. And utilitarianism does that, Christianity does that, Hinduism does that, certain other kinds of ecofeminisms do that. So the more that these traditions can come out and challenge the basic assumption, the better.
Is there one area where there might still be some tension with Peter Singer around his utilitarian premise that it's sentience and one's ability to suffer as an animal, human or non-human, that makes one a subject of moral discourse? That perspective and a Christian perspective which says all of God's creation is good because it's God's creation. Is that a tension that you guys navigate?
Yeah, so that is definitely still a tension, and I think it raises its ugly head more when it comes to issues about biotechnology and biotechnological research, medical research, because we're now getting so good at manipulating these animals that we use in such research. You can even manipulate their brains to the point where it's not clear that they are feeling pain, or even just grow animals that have a brain stem and no cortex. And that's actually the reason why this comes to mind, is because that's the subject of the article I'm writing for the Journal of Moral Theology. Is most of the public still has a negative moral reaction to those kinds of biotechnological innovations, but it's not clear that utilitarianism gives us a way of articulating that. And so here's where moral theology, I think, really can come in and say, well, no, God created animals good to flourish as the kind of beings that they are, and when we don't allow them to flourish as the kind of beings they are, whether they're sows in gestation crates or mice we create without cortexes, this is a problem for allowing consumerist and other kinds of social structures to impact the flourishing of animals. So that is I don't think, and it's interesting, Peter Singer in his latest book says, I think I'm not a preference utilitarian anymore. He doesn't know what he is, but so maybe the world's most famous utilitarian has questioned utilitarianism as his own methodological approach.
All right, we have time for a couple more. Let's see how many hands there are. Got Colin. Anyone else? Okay, Colin, you can ask the last question. You don't need a microphone.
So I wonder about, for both of you, reframing in terms of the human level, because you actually ended with the human consequences, according to the Catechism, of maltreating animals. So would you ever try to combat the apathy that students and others would have about animal treatment by saying, well, this is actually about the people that have to treat the animals badly?
Yeah, I think it's a both and approach there. So if you can get people plugged in through the animal suffering, that's the way we should do it. We should not talk about that. But if you can get them listening, I think that's, I mean, worker justice is something that is actually my students still care more deeply about, I think, is worker justice. And there are lots of things to say about workers in intensive farms that really need to be said, and particularly with regard to undocumented workers and the role they play. But yeah, maybe that's something I needed to do more intentionally in order to get them involved.
I'll just say my experience has been slightly different. I don't encounter that much apathy. In fact, most of the time when I meet with people, they're appalled by what's happened. And what's exciting to me, and the reason that I came to this, because I was trying to exercise my faith in very real ways. I was in Christian theology and systematic theology, in fact, and things start to unravel when you put your faith under a microscope. And I was desperate for an action that that sort of brought my faith down in very like earthy, real ways. And you know, we make choices every day that impact the lives of animals. It's not just food. I mean, probably hundreds of decisions every day that impact their lives. So this is actually an inspiring thing for us. There are so many opportunities for us to choose less suffering and to choose good, and you know, that's a spiritual discipline. So.
Well, thanks. That's a nice point on which to end. Both of you, Charlie and Christine, are really pioneers in raising these issues, bringing them to the attention of a wider audience. They're going to be with us for forever, for years to come. They haven't always been. And particularly, Charlie, your work in the context of Catholic moral theology is very important. And this bridge to Catholic social thought is an important one to be debated for years to come. So thanks so much for being here. Thank you all for joining us. And please join me in thanking Charlie and Christine once again.